is Roger Capello, bringing you My Week at the Club, episode number 67. And this week I have an interesting game again that I played with Bruce Felton last night. But first I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about sort of an astronomy topic. You know, astronomers don't just look and, only deal with what's going on in the sky. We actually need instrumentation to do it. Optics, electronics, computers, things of that sort. So, we typically have a wide range of interests. And I'm also interested in optics and acoustics and stuff. So I wanted to talk about an optical topic today, which is one-way mirrors. So you see them all the time in cop shows, but a dirty little secret is that there's no such thing as a one-way mirror. Okay, well, you might argue, well, you see it all the time. Why? How can there not be such a thing? Well, it's because it's not truly one way. So it comes from fundamental physics. If you look at Maxwell's equations, which are pretty scary things, I guess, partial differential equations, you can solve for a wave equation. That is how light was explained and radio was discovered that way. And an interesting thing about that wave equation is that time only shows up as a quantity that's squared, which means it doesn't matter whether it's positive or negative, you get the same result. And that mathematically is saying that the equations are time reversible. They run forward as well as backward, just the same way that they run forward. And so according to sort of fundamental physics, there is no way to have a device that passes light in one direction but not in the opposite direction. So what's going on in that case? Well, what's happening, I guess a hint would be that if you looked at a scene like they have in the movie, you'd notice that the interrogation room is always brightly lit, and where the people that are watching in that room is dimmer. And what you have is a mirror that is what's called a partially silvered mirror. It reflects some light and transmits some light, typically 50-50. And they do that by having a very thin layer of aluminum or silver on the back of the mirror that's only 50 layers of atoms thick. It's quite a thin layer. And if they make it thin enough like that, then roughly half the light gets through and half of it gets reflected back. And in the bright room, you're there you look at the mirror and you're seeing a bright reflection of what's in the room and a dim transmission, small amount of light coming from behind. And in the dim room, you're seeing a reflection of a dim room that you're in, but you're seeing the transmission coming through from the bright room. And it turns out that the way that the eye works, you can't see the dim thing when there's a bright thing coming through. It's a phenomenon called masking, and it happens with all of our senses. So an easy example, is with music. If you have a conversation going on and you turn up the music really loud, you can get it to the point where you can't hear the conversation at all. And the people are still talking, and the sound is getting to your ears, but you don't hear it because there's only a limited dynamic range of sounds that you can hear. And when you hear a really loud sound like that, something that's more than 40 dB less gets totally wiped out or masked by that loud sound. And the same thing happens with visual scenes, that really bright things mask the dim things back behind it. It's like during the daytime, if you look up, the stars are still shining up there. And interestingly enough, if you take a telescope, you can see stars during the daytime, even though you can't see them with your eye. And in that case, the sky is much brighter. The blue sky, the atmosphere, is much brighter than the black sky with stars in it behind, and that's masking those distant stars to your eyes. But with a telescope, actually, you can since the stars are very small pinpoints of light, if you expand the scale enough, the sky actually gets to be in a sense dimmer. You spread the power out over a bigger space, whereas the star stays just as bright as it was, and it doesn't get masked anymore. Anyhow, a little complicated, but I thought you might like to know that little tidbit about why there really are no one-way mirrors. So, on to the chess game that I had with Bruce. Well, thanks for sticking around for the game. As I said before, I played Bruce Felton this week, and he's an expert, at least coming into this month's tournament. He was rated 2015, I think. Strong player, current club champion, and I lost to him the last time we played 6 or 8 weeks ago. So I was hoping for revenge, but it's always hard to do with the black pieces. Bruce opened with knight to f3. I copycatted. In fact, we went through several symmetric moves here. He went into what appeared to be the start of a London system, and I went ahead and copied that. Of course, it took me time to figure these moves out, but you wouldn't know it because all I had to do was copy him, but you have to really decide whether or not it's a safe thing to do. And here's where I diverged. I was trying to figure out what to do about this. He's threatening to take my bishop and mess up my pawn structure. And one of the standard possibilities, of course, is to retreat the bishop back to g6. And if he were to take, then I can just take back with my h-pawn. And that's not so bad because, I've opened up a file possibly for my rook to use if I don't castle kingside. If I do castle kingside, this pawn formation is actually not weakened by that much. That's pawn on g6 is a little stronger, if anything, than it was on h7. I mean, it's closer to the center. So that's not horrible. I thought that, if we went down this line, that instead of taking my bishop immediately, he might actually come after it with the knight. And then you can trade the knight for the bishop in the same way. Or I could play bishop takes bishop now. But if I'm going to do that, why waste the tempo going back to g6? So for all those reasons, I decided just to stay pat on f5 and let him go ahead and double my pawns if he wanted to and develop my knight instead. Okay, well, he wanted to. He went ahead and took on f5, and I took back. And granted, black's pawns are not as healthy as they were at the start of the game. On the other hand, as I point out in my comment here, this square on e4 is strongly under my control now with 2 pawns attacking it. And so that's a nice thing, having that grip. And also that pawn might prove useful on the king side. And actually it does in this particular game, but that was only, at this point, only a possibility. So Bruce played queen to d3, immediately attacking that weak pawn. It's not easy to defend. There's really only one way. And so I went ahead and defended it with the pawn to g6. But that fit in with my development idea, which was to fianchetto my dark squared bishop. He developed his knight, I fianchettoed. He played h3. For several moves here, I was concerned with various plans on his part of queen to b5 and possibly, if I had played knight to e4, then this pawn on d5 would be loose, wouldn't be defended, and he would have a double attack on the b pawn and the d pawn. So this is a theme over the next several moves that I had to look out for. I chose not to do that right away. And I played knight to b6, which, sort of puts a stop to it, except even here, I suppose, you could play an immediate queen to b5 check. But, in this case, if he did that, I could just interpose with the pawn, and I think black is fine. The other thing you might do here, I realized, but I decided I just had to live with it in this position, is to, instead of castling, would have been for him to play the queen to a3. And that's kind of annoying because it keeps me from castling. I can play the bishop back to f8 to chase his queen out, but then my bishop's in the way. So that's really not a solution. I could play my queen to e7 that way, but then he can always trade the queens off. And my king is in the center. It's maybe not a problem because we're just in a, we're a late middle game here with the queens off. It's really a queenless middle game, but it's not that dangerous looking to my king. But I didn't really want to do that. I think I might have been forced to. this idea doesn't work so well with, I'd like to play queen d7 and then castle queenside, but that allows him just to come in with the knight and win a tempo on my queen and attack the weak f7 square. So I was not too unhappy to see him castle, and that meant that my king is probably safe from a pawn storm on that side, so I went ahead and castled too. So the game was, feeling fairly comfortable at this point. He plunked his knight down on e5, and I spent a tempo strengthening my pawn structure on the queen side. And he didn't do, I was sort of in this position right, this position right here. I was sort of thinking that maybe I could get him to make an awkward move, and that's in the sense that after I play c6, what if he now plays knight to f3, supporting his knight that's on e5? Well, what I could have done would be to advance my knight into the center, take over that e4 square, and now this has a threat with it. It's one that could easily be missed. But even if he sees it, he has to take time to do something about it. And that's this knight on e5 has no safe escape squares, has nowhere to go to. And so he has to basically make room for it by moving his queen away. And then f6, chasing the knight back, actually, according to Stockfish, is not the best thing to do. I don't know if I would have done that or not. I'm reluctant in this sort of position to put my pawn on f6 because it shuts the eyes of this bishop along the long diagonal. On the other hand, it really holds on to this e5 square, and so I'm not sure whether or not I would have made that move either immediately or a little later. I was uncomfortable leaving his knight on e5, so I might have. But we didn't get to that point because instead, after c6, Bruce just played b3, getting ready to play c4. I came back the other thing, he's getting ready to play c4. He also now just took over control of the c4 and a4 squares, so my knight has no prospects on the queen side anymore, and that's why I really play it back through the square it just left a couple moves ago. He played his knight to f3, and now we did a little knight dance. I saw this coming, and I thought about doing a similar thing to him, but then I decided if he did this, it wasn't so bad for me. And what this is to trade off knights, dragging my queen to the d7 square, and then plunking the other knight into e5. Okay, I wouldn't want to trade my bishop for it. He'd take back with his bishop, and then I'm really weak on the dark squares. But my queen could just move to e7, which it did do. And this didn't seem so bad. I mean, this is, I have fairly good prospects with my queen from that square. And if I ever really have to, and I'm willing to block my bishop's diagonal, I can evict the knight with f6. Okay, he went ahead and played on the queen side, well, in the center, but also getting ready to play on the queen side with c4. And I decided to eject the knight now. He went away. Let's scroll up a little bit here. And then I centralized my rooks so that if he played pawn takes pawn, I was probably going to take back on d5 with my rook. Right, and then that makes it difficult for him to make, further inroads. He could do a minority attack on the queen side, but I think I like black in this position. If I analyze it, it's about even according to Stockfish. So he did not exchange pawns. Instead, he pushed, and that's sort of interesting because that locks up the center, and also kind of gives away what his plan is. He's going to keep pushing that b pawn up to b5 and attack my weak pawns here on the queen side. And I have to do something energetic to counteract that. And what I decided to do was to play on the king side, but there's a bit of a threat right now, and that's that at some point this bishop may come to d6 and skewer my queen and rook. I don't want that to happen. The only thing that's keeping it from happening now is this knight that's on e4. And that knight is pretty easy for him to chase away with either knight d2 or knight somewhere else, and then f3, or just trading knights, knight takes knight. So I have to, he can do that with tempo too, and I have to be a little careful about it. So as a preventative measure, I redeployed my rook now. It's on a better square on e1 on the half-open file, and it supports my knight, makes him think another time about any exchanges on e4, and also at some point may actually prove useful on the e-file because it's looking at his pawn on e3. Okay, scroll up a little bit here. So he continued on with his attack, and now I had time to start my kingside attack. So his bishop's there is an exposed target. I'm able to drive it away. And then I played queen f7, which actually is a fairly strong move. And the reason I did that was because I wanted to play g4, but g4 immediately is not such a hot idea. In this position, if I play g4, he could just simply play knight to h4, attacking my weak f pawn, and I could play my, I have no, it's awkward for me to defend this f pawn. Okay, I could push it, but then he could still use that square. This knight could come in. Instead, if I prepare with queen f7 first, then if we go down this line, which we actually do go down, then you'll see the difference. So he played a4, and when I play g4, pawn takes. Now, if his knight comes to a4, my queen, it didn't come to a4, but if it did come to a4 out here, h4, sorry, I'm saying a4, came to h4, then my queen is over there to defend. I can attack the knight and defend this f5 square, and this pawn is going to move, and I'm going to have a kingside attack here in short order. It's moving along, so things are better off than if I hadn't moved my queen to f7 in preparation. So g4, he takes, I take, and his knight dropped back to d2, possibly thinking about trading for my knight on e4. This pawn, the pawn I have here on g4 is conveniently placed to cramp his f pawn, so that if he pushes it, I can exchange off with my g pawn, open up the g file. And also, if he were to, in this position, to trade off, there's always the threat of me taking back with the rook. So first I made a preparatory move, bishop to h6, and the idea behind that is to really prevent this f2 to f3 move that I said before. So, I was pointing out that it could be used to drive the knight away. But in this case, it would be a very bad idea, of course, because this pawn on e3 now is crucially weak. So after a pawn takes pawn, actually not even that. Sorry. I just go ahead and take his knight at this point. And now he can't take back with the queen because my bishop takes with a fork, checking the king and the queen. Okay, so he can't. That puts so much firepower is brought to bear on e3 that with the bishop and the rook with the discovered attack that keeps his f pawn at home. And in fact, it starts to introduce the idea of a sacrifice of my knight on f2, and So even if he just did a pawn push here, I was considering knight takes pawn, right? And if he takes back, then I would probably play rook takes attacking the queen. And I have all sorts of things here. Obviously, after the queen moves, I have the pawn up forking the bishop and the rook. His position is falling apart. So in order to prepare for that, what Bruce did was to, after I played bishop to h6, I'm wrong. I'm misremembering the flow of the game here. I thought in this position that he played rook h3, but he strengthening the e pawn, but he didn't. He actually pushed the b pawn, and that's really a crucial mistake. I mean, he really needed to trade the knights off first and then push the b pawn. If he did that, if he took on e4 and I took back and pushed the b pawn, it's a chess game. I push my f pawn, he exchanges, and then maybe comes out with a queen to attack my weak pawns on the queen side. He has some queen side play here, and I have an attack that on the king side that maybe is going to be in time. But he didn't do that. And so instead in this position, he played b5, taking time out to, move that queen side attack along. But the problem is, even better than that sacrifice of the knight on f2, I discovered this move, g3. And this is a real problem for him. In fact, it was so big of a problem, as I say in the notes here, he actually fought for probably half an hour or so. It was a long, long time. And the reason is because there aren't any good moves. The eval, I think, went from like +1 to -3 with the last pair of moves. And so, I have a couple of the variations here of what could happen. Except I've cluttered it up now with knight takes f2. It's a little hard to see what's going on. But one of the things he could have done, would have been to take my pawn with his pawn. Now, right away, that locks his bishop, at least temporarily, back behind the pawn. But even worse than that is that allows me just to play knight takes knight. If he doesn't want to lose a piece, he takes back with a queen, and then promptly loses his queen to that bishop fork. So basically, once I play knight takes knight, he can't afford to take it back, and he's lost a piece. So pawn takes pawn is not a serious contender here. What else is there? He could attack my knight with his pawn, I suppose, but of course that's just a non-starter. I could either play knight takes knight or pawn takes bishop check with tempo, king moves, and then I take the knight. And he could take back, but this is just getting ugly. I could take back either with the bishop or the rook. Either way would be good. I'm a piece up, and his position is crumbling. So that's really not an option. So what he did do was to go ahead and take the pawn, and this at least gives him the possibility of not losing a whole piece. I played knight takes bishop, and now if he had taken my knight back with his pawn, which looks like the natural move, then probably my best move is just to go ahead and play bishop takes pawn check. And now his king can't come to the h-file because, well, I can just show it, king to h2 or something like that, and queen out would be mate. So he couldn't do that. And what he'd have to do, instead of moving the king, is interpose the rook. And so I'm at least winning the exchange here. And right at this instant, well, we both have 6 pawns, but his double G pawns are going to quickly go, and this is really not a happy position for for white. I mean, I go ahead and attack his G pawn. He attacks my bishop. I go ahead and cash in on that, and then I get my rook into the game. I mean, this is just looking pretty grim. So there's really the play is all in in the one end zone. It's not on mine. So he didn't choose to do that, and instead what he did was to just go ahead and give up the bishop as lost, and he just moved away his rook that was attacked. Well, that gives me time to consolidate my gains with knight to e4, and I sort of expected him to play knight takes knight, rook takes, but he didn't do that. He played knight f3, which is also a move. And it allows me to, keep my knight in the center on a very strong square, and I'm attacking along the G file now, or I can attack along the half-open G file. And the question just is, how can I get it happening fast enough to come in before he gets a crucial passed pawn and rams it down my throat on the queen side. And so I didn't really want to take time out to defend my queen side if I could keep from doing that. And I wanted to try to figure out how to mobilize my pieces as rapidly as possible. So I considered, for example, queen to g6, and I thought that the play might continue with him exchanging the pawns, and then coming in and attacking my A and C pawns. My plan in that case would have been to defend my A pawn, let him take the C pawn, and move my rook over to the G file, threatening mate. And this is one way to go. It's strongly in black's favor, but it's not as good as the plan that I struck on in the game, which is just to play my king to h8 and open up g8 for my rook. And that has the advantage of keeping my queen around a little longer, helping to keep an eye on my queen side. Okay, he played his king off, got his king off of that file immediately, which I was glad to actually to see that move, because it was one more move that his queen side didn't roll into action. So I went ahead and continued to ramp up my attack on the G file. He moved his rook away from, at first I wondered why he did this, and the rook is behind this pawn, and if it ever becomes a pass pawn, it'll help it to go fast. So I think he's probably thinking about rooks on the B and C files. But the main idea is that he's opening up this E1 square for his knight to use, so that after I play queen to G6, which is what I did, threatening to come in and capture on G2, he can now drop the knight back to defend. And with it knight on E1, it's a bit harder to attack him there on the king side. Okay, I should point out that at this point in the game, I had 18 minutes to his 39 or so. So I was starting to feel some serious time pressure, and I was a piece up and felt that I had a winning attack on the king side, but I was getting seriously concerned that I wouldn't be able to do it in the time allowed. But you got to just keep trying to find moves. So I went ahead and improved my other rook, putting it on the E file, where it could threaten to come into the game, and also to, in some variations, it's important that I have control of the E file if his king starts trying to run across through the E file. He went ahead and captured. I really need to recapture. I can't afford to give him a pair of passed pawns there. I took back, and he played A5. I sort of expected him to abandon his king side with his queen, and to come over here and instead of pushing that pawn, come over here and hassle my pawns. But if he's going to win my A pawn, say, then eventually he's going to have to push his A pawn, so it's maybe not a wasted move. But it does give me a tempo to try to improve what I'm doing. Now, unfortunately, I can't, discover attack with my knight to G3. It doesn't quite work, because his queen, my queen would then attack his queen, but his queen is defended by his knight. So in order to even move my knight and not have queens get traded off, I need to get off of that square. And where I went was to g5 with a increasing the threat on e3. So here's the point where I was confusing moves a while back. So the serious threat here is this is really where I was considering knight takes f2 if he doesn't do something. So say he I don't know, continued to push his a pawn, played a6, then I could play knight takes a2. And now he can't trade off queens anymore. His queen's under attack. He pretty much has to take it with his king. And I was thinking, I could play queen g3 check. I was, at the time, what I was seriously considering was rook takes e3. And he can't take that with his queen because I have my queen and bishop both on it. He just loses queen. And he has to move the queen. And then I can come in check. And he goes to back rank. And now rook takes, there are many moves, but rook takes e1 check is kind of picturesque, because if he takes it with the queen, he gets checkmated on g2, because the queen is, the queen has to guard this crucial square. And if he takes it with the rook, then my bishop is just going to win his queen. So, it's that would have been ugly. And for those reasons, Bruce saw what was happening and played his rook to a3 so that he has one more defender on this e3 square, and that combination that I was just looking at wouldn't work. So I shift the attack. I attack f2 now, threatening mate on f2. The question is not whether to defend it, but how. I thought he might push the pawn, but I was going to be happy with, if he played f3. I was fairly happy with this idea of knight to g3 check. And this is just bad. He doesn't want to play to g1 because my queen comes into h1. If he plays up here, there are various possibilities of a discovered check in the future. I have all kinds of good things that can happen here, good moves. So instead he defended the f2 pawn with his rook from c2 along the rank. And I played rook to g5. And the idea here is a couple of ideas. One is getting ready maybe to double my rooks on the g file. Another idea is to play this rook to h5 and my queen to g4. And the idea is that for my queen to cut off this escape square and to threaten checkmate with the rook on h1. Notice that in this position, before I play the rook up, if I played my queen to h1 check, he just runs out with his king, out through e2 and then over to his queen side. I didn't want that to happen. If he went there right now, I can check him and then force him to come back, basically. So I played rook g5, and here he played pawn to g3, which is proves to be a fatal weakening of his king side. But the position is lost. It's just a question of how what the winning plan is. It varies according to the defense that white chooses. And at this point, I didn't have time really to calculate it all, but it looked awfully strong to just go ahead and sacrifice, which is what I did. Knight takes check. He really has no choice but to take this, because otherwise he goes. Otherwise he gets mated next move. Yeah, right. If the king moves either to g1 or to g2, then queen h1 would just be mate. So it's forced. And he has to take it. After he takes it, I take back with the rook, and now it seemed to me like his king. His king is really bare. Plus, I have an immediate threat on e3 of my rook, bishop, and my other rook all attacking it, and it's only defended twice. And he played rook to g2, and then I got a little flustered for some reason. It might be because I only had a couple minutes on my clock. At this point I'd stopped recording moves, and was having to make moves quickly, and I couldn't quite figure out what would work. I was looking at taking with the e-pawn with making this move. Rook e takes e3. But then, you might play rook on g2 takes my g3 rook, and it was queen is falling, but was I getting enough material and so on. And what I didn't see was what I had been planning on all along, which was the idea of rook takes here, because I had to attack 3 times, and there's really no answer to this. And either the queen moves and his rook, if his queen moves away, the rook behind it is x-rayed, so he loses the rook. If he takes my rook, I take with the bishop. He doesn't want to invest another rook against my bishop, but he really has no choice, because I'm threatening to come in, with a mating attack. He takes, I take. This is just gruesome. I'm up a queen for a knight in that variation, I guess. Anyhow, there's a forced mate. So instead, I played rook takes rook. He took back with the knight, and that allowed me to play check. King has to come up if he doesn't want to lose a knight. I attacked the knight a second time, threatening to win it. Only move to save it here is to play the queen there and offer a queen trade. I didn't want to trade queens, so I moved and also repinned the knight so the knight wouldn't move away. And then he played his rook to a2 to give an indirect defense of the knight so that his king now can step away, so there'd be enough defense. But this doesn't work, because I was able to find the crucial final combination of the game here. Queen g3 check, and he looked at it for a minute or so, and just as his flag fell, he resigned, because there's really no good move here. And so, for example, if he plays his king to g1, I can play with bishop takes check, because that knight is pinned. He can't take my bishop. The only thing he can do, well, he could block with the queen, I guess, but that would be foolish. Block with the rook. And this doesn't work too well, because I step off of the line with my queen, and now he's starting to run out of moves. He can push his a pawn, but then I can take the d pawn, and now he really has run out of moves. He's in total Zugzwang, and he has to move his queen. That's the only legal move that he has left. And the queen is a vital defender right now of g2, and when the queen moves away, now we just take, and that's checkmate. But that didn't happen. Back in this position, he resigned. I should say another possibility, the only other possibility, is king e2. And what I had planned on was just to take with my rook, or my queen. If he exchanges queens, I take back with the rook and win his rook with an x-ray attack. If he interposes, that's no better. Or at least not much better. I could just trade the queens off and have too much winning material. What I could do instead is to first make my position safe for my queen to move away, and to move my queen, threatening a pin. And if he comes over with his rook, I mean, there's just too many possibilities for black. So that's a pretty easy win. I probably would have traded queens off, though, given that I was so short in time. So that was the game, and it all came down to that one move, really, back when he played b5 on, let's see, right on this move, and allowed me to play g3. If that hadn't happened, then the result of the game might have been quite different. But it did, and so it came out as a win for me. That was the end of the tournament. I had 4 out of 5. Richard Hubbard won the tournament with 5 out of 5. Played very, very well. He not only beat me, as you saw a couple weeks ago, he then proceeded to beat Bruce the next week, and then Paul Godin last night. So he had an excellent tournament. So that's it from my week at the club. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.